So here's the thing, Doctor Who is one of my personal favourite TV programs of all time. Yes, even when it's bad, in fact, it is mostly bad. Okay, so maybe not bad. Doctor Who is a TV show with some really high highs and some really low lows. One of these highs is the 2008 episode Midnight from Series 4 of the Doctor Who revival. This episode is set almost entirely within the confines of a tour bus travelling on an irradiated tourist attraction planet called Midnight, when some kind of unseen entity that physically shouldn't even be able to exist on the planet's surface starts terrorizing the passengers, mostly through use of psychological warfare. What exactly this entity is never fully resolved. 17 years later, it's season 2, series 15, season 41. I hate this fucking show. Whatever you want to call it. The 2025 season of the show. The Doctor, now played by Gawa, encounters this entity again. This time its behavior is a little bit different. So, what's the deal with the Midnight entity? We're gonna get to the bottom of this. Let's investigate. Let's start with the basics. Let's first talk about the planet Midnight. What up? We know that it's an airless planet located in the Xeon system. There is no life in the entire system. There is an extonic star radiating the planet with galvanic radiation. All of this is just fictional science technobabble to tell the audience that this planet is hazardous and fucking desolate, yo. The surface of the planet shines and has stellar hues, so naturally what the human race decides to do is capitalize on it. That's supposed to be a dollar sign. It doesn't look like a dollar sign. Well, I suppose for Doctor Who authenticity, I might actually... I think that's what a pound looks like. The human race decides to capitalize on it, and Leisure Palace is established on the surface of the planet. The Leisure Palace company would have frequent tours between the Leisure Palace and a named attraction called the Sapphire Waterfall. This trip was undertaken frequently and never had any issues. 400,000 years later, in the 2025 episode The Well, it's established that at some point this planet was then turned into a mining operation and was basically completely stripped bare of its resources, so the planet was then renamed 6767. Okay, now let's briefly outline the events of these two episodes and the different abilities displayed by the Midnight entity in them. 2008's Midnight, the Doctor, played by David Tennant, taking the aforementioned trip from the Leisure Palace to the Sapphire Waterfall. However, there are diamond falls across the route they usually take, so the AI on the computer navigates a new path for them to take. This path is not one that has ever been taken before, and as far as we know is completely unexplored. The tour bus then stops despite there being no technical fault. Common AIL. The Doctor, being the Doctor, checks it out. He gets the shutters on the window open, and the mechanic sees a shadow which he describes as rumbling dark. A little bit later, there's banging on the outside of the bus, despite instances that it's absolutely impossible for there to be anything outside. It bangs along different sides of the bus, which implies it moves very fast. It also tries the door. One of the passengers knocks on the door, and the entity outside copies back. All of the passengers are panicking, and one of them, named Sky, is most obviously scared, like she's freaking the fuck out. It then goes dark, and then when the emergency lights are turned on, all the seats are ripped up. We also discover that the driver's compartment has been ripped clean from the bus. Sky is kind of cowering in the corner with her back turned to everyone else. She then starts copying everyone's speech. It becomes pretty clear that the entity somehow got inside while leaving the wall completely intact and is now inside Sky, or has become Sky. The Doctor then speculates about the entity's intent because of his suspicious behavior by virtue of being the Doctor. The entity's speech then syncs up completely with the Doctor and stops copying everyone else. After syncing, Sky then begins to slowly start speaking ahead of the Doctor, and the Doctor becomes petrified, like he's frozen and still copying her. The passengers at first think that this means that the entity is somehow transferred over to him and left her alone, until Sky says something reminiscent of the Doctor, and it becomes clear that she's stolen his voice. The hostess of the bus is the one who recognizes this, and she then sacrifices herself by grabbing Sky and throwing both of them out of the bus, where they are presumably vaporized by galvanic radiation. Now, to compare to 2025's The Well, the Doctor, played by Gawa, and his companion Valinda find themselves in the middle of a recovering mission by soldiers entering a base on the mining colony planet, now designated 6767. As they enter the base, it's observed that all the miners are smashed. The base is absolutely littered with dead bodies. Half of them are broken limbs, and the other half have been shot. They stumble across their only survivor, a deaf woman named Alice Fenley, who worked kitchens at the base. She says she's been alone for 15 days after killing another crew member. Belinda thinks she sees something behind Alice, but then second guesses herself. No one else can see it until they begin to maneuver around her. Alice then says that this is how it happened before. As a trooper walks around Alice, they are thrown around the room and break limbs and die. Alice then explains that 15 days ago something came out of the well. The other crew members said that whatever it was emerged laughing. Some of the soldiers are resistant to believing it. Alice then explains that the creature behind her back transfers through killing, and that if they were to just kill Alice, then it would then transfer over to them. The Doctor then ascribes a new motivation to it, specifically that the entity was having fun. Many of the troopers then try to undermine their commander Shire's authority by just completely denying the entity's existence, and then just instantly get their shit rocked with one of the coolest musical stings this show's had in 10 years. All that aside, there's this really interesting behavior that the entity has where it doesn't kill just when someone is standing behind the host. It kills when someone is looking straight at the host and then another person walks behind them. which, like, okay, seems like a bit of a convoluted way to kill people, but like, the entity can do whatever it wants, I guess. Shirley then declares that they will have to abandon mission. The doctor then decides to try and talk to the entity. As it turns out, the entity does now have some kind of means of communicating that the doctor can understand because he learns that it knows his name. The doctor then basically has its own entity reflect behind itself. You got Alice here, doctoring whatever over here. The entity is like here. So what the doctor does is puts a mirror here, a mirror of Mercury. So that means that now behind this entity, there is now a reflection of itself there. Anyway, that forces it to, like, separate from Alice, I guess. I don't fucking know. Everyone runs, and then we, like, vaguely see its form, which is shadowy and dark. Alice and two troopers get into the airlock to evacuate. The airlock then says that there are 4 occupants. Everyone who hasn't evacuated yet is then thrown to the ground, and they all begin to speculate that it is now behind them. Melinda then says that she can hear whispering. The doctor offers to give himself up, but then Shia takes the entity on and sacrifices herself by throwing herself into the well. One of the remaining troopers, who is also in that same room with the doctor, Bell, and Shia, reports their findings at the mining colony to their superior, and then another officer seems to see something behind them. Cut to black. Now, I'm sure you may be wondering, if there's supposedly 4 people in the airlock, but only 3 characters, does that mean that the entity got away in the evacuation? Probably. I mean, that seems to be what the episode is implying. But what about all that whispering that, like, Belinda heard? And that trooper that seemed to have something behind him at the end? You know what, who fucking knows? You may be shocked to discover that I do not actually care about what the objective truth of the Midnight Entity. There are so many creators who have actually talked in depth about what the Midnight Entity actually physically is within the Doctor Who universe. If you're looking for something more along those lines, I would suggest this video by protagonist. Sorry for that whole tweet. So why did I do all this? Why did I bother to detail all of this if I'm not going to outline the objective truth of the Midnight Entity in Doctor Who? Let's rewind a bit to that 2008 episode. After Skye is seemingly possessed by the Midnight Entity, passengers aboard Crusader Tours find her appearance unsettling. One passenger, Val, remarks on her eyes. Dee Dee, who is a research assistant, then begins quoting a passage from the poem Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti.
We must not look at goblin men, we must not buy their fruits. Who knows upon what soil they fed their hungry, thirsty roots?
I'm not going to read the whole thing here because that was straight up take 20 minutes. But if you're interested, you can find it basically anywhere. If you want to listen to it and you're, like, burdened with Doctor Who brain rot, right here on YouTube there's actually a reading done by Ursula Blake and
Bleeding unicorn.
We must not look at goblin men. We must not buy their fruits. Who knows upon what soil they fed their hungry, thirsty roots?
The story of the poem involves 2 sisters, Lizzie and Laura, who are completing their usual day-to-day. Laura is intrigued, but Lizzie warns Laura away. Completely ignoring this, Laura buys fruit from the goblin, exchanging a lock of her golden hair. Yes, there is vaguely anti-Semitic imagery at play here, as there is with basically any portrayal of goblins ever. Don't shoot the messenger, that's just like a fact of goblin everything. I'm not going to touch on it here, but yes, I am aware. Anyways, Laura buys the fruit and it's like the most amazing thing she's ever consumed. She gets home and her sister completely berates her for it, but this doesn't dissuade Laura. Laura vows to buy more the next day. However, when the next day comes, Laura is completely unable to hear the goblins, although her sister still can. Laura basically falls into a deep depression over this and quickly becomes a shell of her former self. She's unable to complete her usual tasks and she's basically wasting away. Lizzie, in a desperate need to help her sister, decides to approach the goblins and buy some fruit from them for her. The goblins do not take kindly to her buying for another rather than eating it herself and begin to force her to eat the fruit and attack her. Lizzie eventually gets away from the attack and arrives home, beaten, bleeding, and completely covered in the juice from the fruit. Laura then tries to drink the juice from the pulp off her body and just finds that the taste no longer satisfies her, but instead repulses her. The next morning, Laura then wakes up, returned to full health, and her and her sister live long and happy lives and have children of their own. The choice to include this poem in Midnight is a really fascinating one to me because it's a poem that has so many layers and potential reading. In 2003, Herbert Tucker proposed the idea of Goblin Market as a commentary on pre-capitalism within Victorian English society. The free market was on the rise and industry began to accelerate. It's not exactly a stretch to read the Goblin Market as a literal market. They do not have the best interests of the girls at heart. They merely seek personal gain and completely discard the customer who is no longer of value to them, completely leaving them as like a shell of their former self. This line, come by, the goblins say, in the text is written as by. There's an intentionality in the word choice. The use of homonym draws to mind the rising flea market and likely a heightened version of situations that contemporary readers of the time were probably familiar with. With this reading in mind, Doctor Who's Midnight becomes a cautionary tale about corporate profit over human lives. The planet Midnight is an inhospitable planet where even just walking on the surface for seconds can kill you. The Leisure Palace Company turns it into a tourist attraction that emphasizes the aesthetics as a draw. The Leisure Palace Company packages the planet as the peak of opulence. We're told the planet is covered in diamonds. The Leisure Palace names a waterfall that their tour busters frequent trips to Sapphire Waterfall, despite sapphire and diamonds being different things. It doesn't matter that they're different things. What matters is the idea they're selling. Even 400,000 years later, when the planet is no longer a tourist destination, it's been turned into a mining colony. The surface has been completely stripped of all its resources. The planet itself was commodified. You can even go as far as to say that it draws parallels to real-life colonialism, although I am very hesitant to draw the comparison one-to-one, because while there's definitely an argument to be said that the Midnight Entity, as native to the planet, had absolutely every right to retaliate against invasion, Doctor Who doesn't really linger on this concept in either Midnight or The Well. And if anything, I sincerely doubt this was the intention, or at least I'd hope it's not the intention. I'd hope it was not the intention of the narrative to frame what is functionally a member of what is presumed to be an indigenous population of this alien planet as this evil sadistic monster who fucks around with people for the fun of it and even commits actual literal murder. I don't know about you, but the implications of that just don't feel good to me. One of the fairly dominant readings of Goblin Market is the poem's relationship to religion, in particular Catholicism and Christianity. Christina Rossetti was extremely devout and used a lot of religious imagery in her writing. And I know what you're thinking, what on earth could this possibly have to do with Doctor Who? Well, Rossetti Davies, who wrote Midnight and also co-wrote The Well, has something of a fascination with religion. This may strike you as odd considering he's a staunch atheist, and that's not exactly a secret about him, but it is worth noting that despite being an atheist, Rossetti Davies is also a gay man who was a young adult during the AIDS crisis, a time when a dominant cultural perspective by the public, while people he knew were dying around him, was that they deserved it because they were sinners in the eyes of God. Without even mentioning his other work, his Doctor Who alone is littered with religious imagery. While I personally don't think any of the heavy-handed religious imagery has ever worked in the context of the show, and I think most people agree with me on that, I can also respect that there's a lot of power appropriating religious imagery and reclaiming it with this property and character he loves on national British television, especially if it's Christmas and you've got that desirable Christmas Day time slot on the BBC, and also Kylie Minogue's there. Goblin Market draws parallels to the Book of Genesis, aka the one with the apple. Eve is warned off eating the forbidden fruit, but is then tempted by the serpent, who tells her that if she eats it, that her and Adam will be indistinguishable from God, and as a result she commits the first sin and causes the fall of man. Shit happens. Laura eats the forbidden fruit from the goblin and then suffers for it. Lizzie then kind of acts as a Christ-like figure. She is brutalized to try and save Laura, metaphorically dying for her sin. When Lizzie arrives home and Laura tries to drink the juice from the fruit off her body, it's emphasized that the juice is actually mixed in with Lizzie's blood, which has incredibly eucharistic connotations and draws direct parallel to Holy Communion and drinking the blood of Christ, which then cures Laura of her ailment and presumably also her sin. Both Midnight and The Well involve characters sacrificing themselves for the collective. In Midnight we have the hostess, and in The Well we have Shire. But these sacrifices are never really framed as redemptive or noble or necessary. They're primarily framed by both narratives as needless. After the hostess sacrifices herself, people on the bus don't atone for the things they've done. They don't even take accountability.
I said it was her.
Midnight is an episode where the Doctor doesn't save the day. In fact, their attempts to save the day just causes things to escalate. It's a kind of bleakness the show rarely indulges in, and the rarity of it strengthens its impact. There is no literal temptation or forbidden fruit in Midnight, but we do have our serpent. The entity is persuasive, it tempts everyone towards their worst impulses, and the narrative proposes that the only way forward, once you have engaged in these impulses, is to just live with it. As a sequel, The Well implies that not only is sacrifice completely needless, but it's pointless. The worst of our potential will always exist, and to even attempt to destroy it would be a waste of a sacrifice. The religious framework that Christina Rossetti's work is based in is incredibly important, but almost equally as important is how that intersects with her bordering feminist beliefs. The dominant belief among many of her contemporaries was that women's value exists only as an object of desire, an object that's warranty expires the moment she is possessed in any way by a man. This includes sexual assault. A woman who survived horrific acts of sexual violence would then still be considered a sinner, and her reputation would be irreparably tarnished. The term for a woman who had been perceived to have gone against God through sexual activity outside of marriage was a fallen woman. There were a handful of religious Magdalenes dedicated to these women, with the primary mission statement of institutionalizing and then rehabilitating these women and allowing them some form of social redemption. And in 1859, Christina Rossetti actually volunteered at one of them for several years. I'm not going to pretend that Magdalenes were this great feminist safe haven for women, because they factually were not, they still existed within the institution of the church. Christina Rossetti did not identify herself as a feminist personally. She believed that direct social reform was actually in direct opposition to her faith, but she did also have an intense fascination with individualistic ideas of redemption and the capacity for the marginalized to be worthy of salvation. Forbidden fruit becomes allegorical. The allegory is sex, by the way. And the goblins become men who can modify women as sex objects, even outside of marriage, yet never face more remotely comparable consequences. The goblins' attack on Lizzie becomes a parallel of brutal sexual violence. Remember when this video was about Doctor Who? Now other female characters in the Doctor Who story Midnight. You have Dee Dee, who is a research assistant. She's clever but consistently dismissed by her white male supervisor, who just uses her as his tea-girl. We have Val, who is a wife and a mother. She's like the quintessential wife. She weaponizes her identity to appear fragile, but has a violent underbody. Underbody? What the fuck? Violent underbelly. He's consistently dismissive of her teenage son, who is like vaguely alternative and played by a 20-something-year-old Colin Morgan not long before Merlin first aired. She makes some vaguely xenophobic remarks towards the Doctor.
I'm just travelling. I'm a traveller, that's all.
Like an immigrant.
Basically, she's what some would describe as like a Karen. Guy who was the most scared, and she's the one targeted by the Midnight Entity. Guy is dressed like the typical businesswoman. She's childless, she's divorced, and she's a lesbian. The others on the tour bus find it easy to believe that potentially this was just a nefarious plot because she was quiet, aloof, and seated alone. She doesn't perform femininity in a way that is necessarily expected of her, and that makes it easy for some of the other passengers to consider her dangerous. Finally, we have the hostess. She does not have a name. Her personhood is barely even considered at all. When the Doctor asks the other passengers upon her deck what her name was, no one can answer. It's just like a brief aside, but I also want to note that Dee Dee and the hostess are both black women, so are therefore sitting at that intersection of both gender and race. But also, this is Russell T Davies in 2008, where the most recent major black characters he had written were Mickey and Martha, who he both treated like absolute dog shit. So I don't actually think that that particular aspect of Dee Dee and the hostess's characters was even considered like once during production. Russell T Davies didn't learn that racism exists until like 2024, and he kind of talks about it with the same energy as that one meme from like 2020. I just heard about racism, that shit sucked meme. You know the one. Despite its almost definite unintentionality, I do find it noteworthy because these are also the two characters that ultimately do believe the Doctor and realize what is happening. While Val, this like fucking middle-class white lady, barks orders and demands that the Doctor get thrown out of the bus. When Hostess then realizes that it is in fact the possessed guy that is still a threat and then sacrifices herself, Val is quick to try to like save face and claim that she actually knew that it was her, rather than face any consequences or like admit to any wrongdoing. With the exception of the Doctor, who's a bit of a funny case, most of the men in the story are completely inconsequential. The Professor is functionally an accessory to Dee Dee, establishing her social status and acting as a stand-in for the aging white patriarchy that doesn't take her seriously. His only major contributions to the story are like bits of exposition that, when revisiting the Midnight Entity 17 years later, would be just completely redistributed to the Doctor. Biff, who I literally had to Google the name of, acts merely as like a yes man to Val, who's his wife. Even Jethro, who Doctor Who fans remember fondly because he's like a quirked up emo twink played by Colin Morgan in 2008, does not contribute to the overall narrative and instead functions as a tool to establish Val's character archetype to the audience efficiently. Val is the white suburban matriarch who covertly upholds oppressive ideas and hides it behind her privilege. She is the embodiment of white women's tears. I saw that the Doctor is an interesting, complicated case because while yes, the Doctor, as portrayed by David Tennant in this specific story, is a man and white and mostly conventionally attractive, the Doctor is framed by the narrative as an inherent outsider. While he at first builds a strong rapport with the other passengers, posting on his external features and his charm, they're quick to become alarmed when they discover that he is not actually human. Cue the xenophobic remarks from Val. Their suspicions of him grow when they realize they had to shoot his humanity based on his appearance. They feel as though he has somehow tricked them, that he is dishonest. To me, this draws real-life parallel to people within a marginalized group who are perceived as like passing as like straight or white or cisgender, who are treated as duplicitous or worse if they don't disclose their identity with complete strangers. The 2008 episode puts specific emphasis on the concept of the Midnight Entity stealing the Doctor's voice. But what this actually means kind of left up to interpretation. Objectively, within the narrative, we do not hear the Midnight Entity literally steal the Doctor's voice. When we hear it speak, it only ever sounds like Sky, but the hostess understands that the entity has stolen the Doctor's voice because it begins using catchphrases the Doctor has previously said in front of her. The Midnight Entity does not steal the Doctor's voice in the literal sense. It doesn't start talking like David Tennant. It steals the Doctor's voice in the narrative sense. Voice in this context refers to language and means of articulating. It's the translation of abstract concepts and thoughts into verbal communication in a way that is distinct to the individual. The Doctor is a character who, especially in the last 40 years or so, because the show is old as fuck, is almost defined by their use of language. They generally avoid weapons as a moral rule and instead fall back on words. The times when they don't use words and instead default to violence are typically framed within the narrative as unambiguously bad and as a sign of their own moral compass failing.
We could end this right now. We could save everyone right now.
This is not how we roll, and you know it. What's happened to you, Doctor? When did killing someone become an option?
Rex has to answer for his crimes.
And what then? Are you going to hunt down everyone who's made a gun or a bullet or a bomb?
But they keep coming back, don't you see? Every time I negotiate, I try to understand. Well, not today, no.
See, this is what happens when you travel alone for too long.
To strip the Doctor of their voice is to strip them of their power and agency. This, to me, in conjunction with the rest of the narrative, resembles the systematic oppression that real groups continue to face every single day. The concept of marginalized groups being voiceless due to being stripped or denied of their rights is one that's been around for a very long time. So okay, now what? We've looked at the episode from 2008 and some of the readings that can be drawn from it. Now let's consider for a moment its 2025 sequel, which is significantly less dense, I promise. It's 400,000 years later, the planet Midnight has been commodified and stripped bare. The Midnight entity has seemingly killed everyone on the base except for Alice. Alice is deaf, portrayed by actual real-life deaf actress Rose Ailing-Ellis. She communicates primarily through the use of sign-supported British English. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a simplified version of British Sign Language that utilizes only key phrases rather than signing like every single word, which is fairly typical for TV where like characters sign, or even just like real-life deaf people who communicate with hearing people a lot because it pairs with spoken language as a visual aid. Upon her instruction, the Doctor communicates with Alice through use of sign, but without any kind of spoken language. As the troops do not know sign, the Doctor would be reprimanded for having private conversations. The Doctor then says,
"Doesn't matter the year, signing still makes some people paranoid."
The reason why I bring this up is because when speaking directly to Alice, the troops have their own captioning, can read what they are saying live. However, if they are speaking amongst themselves or in any way not directly to her, they just turn the captions off. They just turn them off. Effectively having private conversations of which she is being excluded from on the basis of her being deaf. Throughout this episode, people around her are in constant control of the information that Alice is being provided with, even actively being excluded. The Doctor isn't innocent of this either. At one point, he turns off his own captioning, stops signing as soon as he stops wanting Belinda to be mindful of Alice, implying that she's potentially dangerous. Alice then discloses to him that she can still read lips, and later in the episode, the Doctor then weaponizes this fact against her by making the decision to turn his back to her while speaking, control the information she is given, as he declares that they're going to abandon her. In the publicly available script of 2008's Midnight, the moment when the Doctor's voice is stolen is described like this.
Thank you.
He leads her away from the Doctor. The Doctor, with no strength, still on his knees, now has his back to everyone so they can't see the panic on his face. And it's easier to blame him when they don't have to look at him.
It's completely separated.
In both stories, the Midnight entity latches itself onto the isolated and the marginalized, and it makes everyone literally turn their backs on them.
He makes you fight,
He makes you fight,
creeps into your head,
creeps into your head,
and whispers.
and whispers.
In the world, the Midnight entity demonstrates a behavior unique to this story. It takes issue with reflections, it smashes mirrors, and seemingly detaches from Alice when reflected back into itself. This behavior is demonstrated only in this story, and we saw no indication of this in the 2008 story, but I don't really care about that, to be honest. What I do care about is how this works in service of theme. If we consider that both depictions deal heavily with the concept of marginalization, then how does reflection factor in? A consideration, perhaps. What if the reflection is not literal? I mean, like, obviously within the text, it is very literal, like it literally happens, we see it, but in terms of like thematically, earlier I suggested that the Midnight entity tempts us towards our worst impulses, like the serpent to Eve, but maybe it's not an external temptation. Maybe the Midnight entity is a reflection of us.
It's what it turns us into.
Maybe the reason why the Midnight entity continues to exist is because it reflects us at our worst. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our nature, about the prejudices and violence that prevails within all of us. It targets the vulnerable and let us see them as villains, because all throughout human history that is all we've done. And when we turn our backs on the people that need the most support, they get hurt. So I acknowledge that was like super long-winded, and to a lot of people that probably just sounds like I was contemplating. But with The Well coming out, I went back and revisited Midnight, and the scene where Dee Dee recites Goblin Market like instantly stuck out for me, and it just like set off like a million fucking light bulbs in my head, and I just like couldn't stop like going into all these different directions and looking into these different ideas. I actually meant to have this video out like several weeks ago, back when like it was actually relevant, but I was too busy playing Minecraft, and then I had to wait for my little hat to arrive, so that was the whole thing. I typically wouldn't do 2 videos in a row about like tangentially similar topics, because I don't let anyone know my next move, but sort of worm has been rotting my brain for like probably like a month now, to be honest.